While most people think photography is a modern invention from the 19th century, the hidden origins of every photograph you take today date back over 1,000 years. This is the story on how photography really began. Most people think photography started back in the 1800s. And today I want to talk about the DNA of photography, the rich heritage and fascinating history of the medium. I want to talk about where it comes from and why we love it so much. And you may think that you don't need to know about the history, but I think you do. It's important to understand the magic of this medium. A lot of people today have not experienced film, chemistry, or the darkroom, and I don't know how much that matters, but what I do see today is that many people in the digital age of photography are starting to adopt these old techniques like cyanotypes and Van Dyke Browns or pinhole photography, and they've been inspired and are considering past movements in photography such as Pictorialism and the F64 Club and the outlook that these movements had, and they're adopting these techniques and these philosophies. These people are looking back at the history throughout photography with a deep respect for the medium. And I see Ralph is just flagging a question here. It looks like it's from Yana. Sammy, why don't you just please just put this on the screen a little bit bigger? I'm just battling to read the small text. There we go. So Yana is asking, what is pictorialism and the 64 Club? So yeah, that's a good question, Yana. And how can I explain this? Think of Photoshop debate or the Photoshop debate in today's time, but let's take it back into the turn of the century. We had the pictorialists. This group of photographers didn't want to take record purpose type photography or documentary type photography or photography as a realistic reproduction. Sam, while I'm talking through this, won't you just look up the work of Leonardo Masson and Ansel Adams just for a moment? That'll help me to explain this properly. So pictorialists wanted their work to look like art, like paintings, charcoal drawings. And the F64 Club was saying, no, photography must be crisp and technically perfect. There we go. Have a look at this on the screen. Here's some photographs by Masson, and they are spectacular. They are soft, they are moody. Pictorialists were happy to use alternative chemical techniques, and they were happy to explore softness in their work, and they were happy to manipulate their work to get a feeling. They were far more experimental. But then you have the technical mastery of someone like Ansel Adams, and here you can see the difference. I mean, this led to the F64 Club, and I mean, if my memory serves me correctly, beside Ansel Adams, there was Edward Weston and Imogen Cunningham, who believed photography should be all about precision. They believed in pure photography and darkroom mastery. You see, Jana, here we have these two different trains of thought in photography, both emerging. One was spectacular and soft and artistic and was beautiful in its own right, and the other was sharp and pure, but also artistic and beautiful in its own right. So, Jana, I've recorded a talk on this exact subject where I question whether photography is indeed art, and we'll put the link into the description below. But for now, let's get back to where photography began. Like I said, so many people think that photography started back in the 1800s, but the principles of photography go way back to the 4th century before Christ. Here we're talking about the Chinese philosophers and later Aristotle, who observed a phenomenon when light came through a tiny hole in a darkened environment, it would project an image on a flat surface. This observation is known as camera obscura. Imagine walking into a darkened room and there's a tiny hole in the wall. On the opposite wall, if the wall is light enough, you will see the image projected in full color. It's upside down, but it will be projected in full color and completely recognizable. Think of this as prehistoric cinema, if you like. Let me give you a real life example. So, in Prague today, there's a tourist attraction, and you can go and see this for yourself. In the attic of the old royal palace, there's a tiny hole in the rafters, and it projects a 4-meter wide image of the more modern buildings onto the wall. You see, by the 1500s, artists had cottoned onto this phenomenon and was already using this for tracing perspective. I mean, have a look at this picture of an artist inside a camera obscura, specifically designed for, in this case, tracing an outside portrait. Light travels through the pinhole and projects the subject onto the medium that the artist is working on. The bundles of light have a beautiful name. They are known as circles of confusion. And I kid you not, go Google it. You'll see it's correct. These little bundles of light form the actual image, but because they overlap one another, they're not perfectly sharp. And the smaller the little hole and the cleaner the edges of the circle, the better it projects. But it'll never be perfectly sharp. And the camera obscura formed the foundation as we moved on towards photography itself. So let me introduce you to some of our heroes in photography. And I'm going to start back in 1685 with a German monk by the name of Johann Zahn. Now, Johann Zahn took this concept of the camera obscura and built a portable version. He used a lens to sharpen the image, as you can see here, and a mirror to reflect the image back onto the glass. This was the precursor to the modern camera. And then he would sketch the image that was being projected on the glass. But there was still a problem. The image was, what could we call it, ghostly. In other words, when there was no light, there was no image, and it disappeared. And there was no way of fixing this image to the surface. You could only trace it. So the race was already on to see how scientists and chemists could trap this ghost. So enter I'm going to call him a superhero, a Frenchman by the name of Nicephore Niepce. He was a countryside scientist, and this was back in 1826, where, for whatever reason, he built a camera, or he built a box similar to what Johann Zahn had built, except he didn't have the mirror inside. It was a straightforward obscura. And for whatever reason, he took a pewter plate and he coated it with a substance called bitumen of Judea. It's like a tar-like substance. And he put it onto the pewter plate and then put the pewter plate into the box and then took the box and put it on the mantelpiece and pointed it towards his courtyard and started the exposure. And he left it there for the entire day. When he came back, and again, for whatever reason, he decided to wash this pewter plate with a solution of lavender oil. Where the highlights had hit during the day, the substance had hardened a bit. And where the shadows were, it sort of washed away. And the image was there, but it was inverted. But Nicephore Niepce had successfully trapped the ghost. And for years, people thought that this story, or this, what could we call it, this image that he had created was an urban legend. And then they found it in an attic one day. And today, you'll be able to see this. It's on permanent display at the University of Texas in Austin. I mean, it's priceless. So whilst Niepce was doing this, across the channel in England is one of our other superheroes. This is William Henry Fox Talbot, a brilliant scientist and a member of the Royal Society. He was working on a negative positive system. I mean, this is the ancestor of the very raw file we know in digital photography today, and it formed the basis of the negative film that we used to use for so many years in photography. Talbot was brilliant, but he was obsessed with patents and red tape. And because he was so guarded with what he was doing, and he worked with everything so close to his chest, the outsider, Niepce, beat him to the history books. I mean, Niepce made it to the line, but Talbot's inventions, in my opinion, were in fact better. Then came Louis Daguerre, and here we're talking about 1839 or thereabout. He used a technique that he had developed, which was known as a daguerreotype. It's a slightly different process in his photography. And he captured the very first photograph of a human. Here you can see it here, a man having his shoe shone in Paris. It was a long exposure time, but because this man had stood still for the entire exposure, he was captured on this picture. And the moment that this picture showed a person could be photographed, photography itself truly took off. It wasn't now just about science. It was about memories, and it was about human identification. The world had now been given a permanent mirror of reflection, if you like. Look, photography is a blend of math, science, and chemistry, and then artistry just thrown in for good measure. And for 150 years, every image that was taken was a moment in time, captured with light, brought to life through a chemical event. And that chemical event is fascinating. Just a moment, I see Ralph is flagging a question. The question is from Ruth. And Ruth is asking, when did color turn up in photography? Ruth, that's a great question, and it fits in perfectly with one of the heroes I'm just about to discuss. So I'll answer your question in a moment. As I was saying, for over 150 years, every image was an exposure taken with light, but then a chemical event that brought it to life. And the two main ingredients in photographic emulsion is light-sensitive silver and gelatin. And gelatin is an animal byproduct. And you will probably know that it's made from the hides and the bones of cattle and pigs. And in photography, gelatin was the magic ingredient. It was known as the perfect binder. It was irreplaceable, really, and it allowed light-sensitive silver to be held in suspension, which means that then it could be, or the light-sensitive silver could be evenly coated onto a medium. And in the early days, that medium was glass. And here's an interesting point. Do you know, at its peak, the photographic industry used 50,000 tons of gelatin every year, and an astonishing 32% of all the silver produced on planet Earth was reserved for film and paper manufacturing in the photographic industry. So this brings us now on to our next hero, a man by the name of George Eastman, and he founded the Kodak empire in Rochester, New York. We don't hear too much about Kodak in this digital age, but this man was monumental in where we are today. He saw a business, he was a businessman, and he saw an opportunity with the public's fascination when it came to photography. And his mission was to put a camera in everybody's hands. And his philosophy was simple. He said, you press the button and we do the rest. His mission was to replace these heavy glass slides, because before this, you would need to go into the darkroom, coat up a piece of glass, put it into the camera, go out, take a picture, come back, put it back into the darkroom, take out the piece of glass, develop it, and you could do one picture at a time. And George Eastman introduced flexible film on a plastic base, film that could be rolled up and inserted into the camera. This meant you could take a whole lot of pictures at one time and also have them developed all together. So he sensitized the silver into gelatin and then coated the plastic and then rolled it up. And he also went into the manufacturing of cameras, making cameras smaller, small enough to interest the general public, and it was an absolute hit. But despite all of his success, George Eastman unfortunately ended his own life. And history tells us he was unwell at the time. And there was a note next to his bed that said, "My friends, my work is done. Why wait?" Now, this is just my theory, but I think this man was under incredible stress. I mean, he was building an empire on a chemical reaction that he didn't fully understand. You see, at one stage, they changed the gelatin supplier, and the film was manufactured and went out, and it came back with no images on it. Nothing would develop. In an absolute panic, they went back to the original supplier, and the images returned. Until the day he died, Eastman never knew why. It was only later that scientists proved that the impurities in gelatin, specifically sulfur sensitizers, were necessary for the process to work. He was building what later became a global empire on a reaction beyond his control. And I think this is what brought him to immense stress and unfortunately probably brought him to illness. So this brings us on to Ruth's question when it comes to when color was introduced into photography. Most people think color is a modern invention, but the quest for color happened almost from the start. In the early days, they used to hand tint black and white photographs using oil paints and dyes. And funny enough, this is still a technique that is very popular, which I teach on my art photography course. But the real commercial breakthrough came again from our friends at Kodak. I mean, there were a number of people trying to produce commercial color film, but Kodak had the breakthrough. And if my memory serves me correctly, it was around about mid-1930s when Kodak introduced Kodachrome. It was the first truly successful color film for the masses. And it was a complex chemical masterpiece. It stayed in production for over 70 years. So Ruth, color has been with us commercially since the mid-1930s, but it also leads on to a very interesting discussion on how we keep those colors from fading. And I'll talk about that just now. So let's head back to the presentation. So while George Eastman was shrinking the world, trying to make cameras a bit smaller, others were trying to increase camera size. I mean, if I asked you the question, what do you think is the world's largest camera ever made? Well, I can tell you it's called the Mammoth. It was built in 1900 by the Chicago and Alton Railroad Company. It weighed a whopping 600 odd kilograms. I mean, that's around 1,400 pounds. And it took 15 men to operate it. It was commissioned for just one photograph, a massive billboard that they required for a train they wanted to photograph. And once the photograph was taken, the camera was dismantled. But funny that going big is not always the answer, because the real future in photography lay in smaller developments. So our next hero is Oscar Barnack. He was a master technician at the Leica factory in Germany, and he was working on movie cameras using 35mm flexible film produced by Kodak at the time. And he had this bright idea to use the movie film, which came in large rolls, but to use the movie film and build a still camera around that film. And he created a camera that you could easily carry in your hands. I mean, this was the birth of street photography. I mean, one of my all-time heroes and mentors is Henri Cartier-Bresson. And it was on this camera that he carved his name into history. Engineering was becoming the heart of the medium. And then came another hero, and a big one, Dr. Edwin Land, an inventor of note. It was around 1943. He was out taking pictures with his 3-year-old daughter, Jennifer. After he had taken the picture, she asked him, "Daddy, why can't I see the pictures right now?" He explained to her that the film needed to go to the lab, and then the laboratory would process them, develop them, and send them back. But as an inventor, that question stayed with him. History tells us that he went for a walk that day, and by the time he came back for a walk, this was in Santa Fe, by the time he came back from a walk, the entire concept of Polaroid and instant photography was already in his mind. He had figured out how to take a picture and then watch it develop up in front of you, right in your own hands, without even having to go to a laboratory. He was the true forerunner of what we have in digital photography today. But remember, at that stage, Kodak was the big kid on the block, and they recognized that there was a huge opportunity here. They were the big brand at the time. I mean, today we've got Google and Apple and Microsoft and McDonald's, but in those days it was Kodak. And instead of working with Edwin Land and Polaroid, instead of going to them and talking to them, Kodak decided to steal the patent. Industrial espionage on a global scale. And they produced Kodak instant cameras and film. And this led to a 14-year legal battle that nearly cost $1 billion. I mean, in today's money, we have to times that by 4. And Kodak ended up losing. And they had to retract every instant camera and every box of instant film that they had ever sold. It was a monumental mistake that almost sunk the empire. But at that stage, Kodak also saw that the writing was on the wall. They knew that the consumption of silver and gelatin couldn't last forever. And they tried to find a substitute. They threw huge amounts of money into research to try to find a substitute for gelatin, and they just couldn't. And in 1975, they appointed an engineer named Stephen Sasson. This is our next hero. And he pioneered the first digital camera for Kodak. It was the size of a toaster. The first digital image was, now listen to this in size, was a incredible 0.01 megapixels. When Kodak executives saw it, they said, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone." They decided at that stage that they were going to shelve this invention for a rainy day. I mean, this happened at boardroom level, where they said that they couldn't fathom a world without photographic film. But while they were busy shelving it, Sony was watching. And Sony found out what Kodak was busy with, and they launched the first commercial digital camera. It's called the Sony Mavica. Here's a picture of it. It recorded images on those old stiffy discs. Some of you might remember the stiffy discs. I wouldn't ask you to put up your hands because, like me, it may just very well give our age away. But at that stage, the gloves were truly off, and Kodak had been caught off guard. They got handed a sucker punch, and in a panic, Kodak tried to catch up. But they didn't have the camera manufacturing capability, so they partnered with Nikon and Canon at that stage, and they created the digital camera science, or what they call DCS. It allowed you to use your Nikon or Canon lenses on their cameras, on their digital camera body. And those early cameras cost an absolute arm and leg. I mean, I remember thinking I'd have to take out a second bond on my home to just buy one. Then in 1990, we saw the next big step. It was a program that turned up that you are well familiar with, and the program is called Photoshop. The digital darkroom had arrived. At first, society sort of didn't greet Photoshop with much contempt. It was seen as a program that you could cheat with. But the power of the chemistry was simply moving now into code, and the season had truly changed. You see, the legacy of Oscar Barnack at Leica lived on in this whole change, because as digital sensors were being developed, a decision was made to match the digital sensor to the size of the 35 millimeter film that he built his camera around. This is what we call full-frame photography today, and I'll be talking more about full-frame and crop sensors in one of the later sessions. But another big leap in technology moved in. And this is what I was talking about when I said to Ruth, it's one thing to have created color. It was another thing to make sure that that color could stay fast. Because up until that time, photography was frowned upon as an art form. It was because color photography was not a permanent medium. Even the highest quality papers at the time could only, at best, offer 20 to 30 years of color fastness. And then the colors would start to fade. And because of this, photography wasn't really considered collectible. Except for certain black and white tone prints that were stable, color photography wasn't. But then inkjet printing turned up on the scene, and we started to see printing with high-quality carbon-pigmented inks on acid-free paper. Photography finally had become permanent. It had become collectible. It had become a fine art form. I mean, today the world of fine art photography is built on this fact. You can order a print today knowing that it will last for over 120 years before there is any noticeable change. So in other words, if we made a print today using today's technology and we put it away, and then in 120 years from now, we made another print using the same technology and put them next to each other, side by side, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference. These prints are now highly collectible because they are archival. I mean, imagine if we could wake up George Eastman today. Imagine saying, George, did you know today, 2026, the people on planet Earth took 5.4 billion photographs just today, and tomorrow they're taking even more. And it's all based on the system that you brought to the masses. I mean, he would be speechless. So would Oscar Barnack and Nicephore Niepce and Fox Talbot and all of our heroes. They would be amazed at what their endeavors turned into. This was the mark these men made on the world. So that leads on to an interesting question. So how many of you here today, including me, have had a great idea and decided to shelve it for a rainy day? If there is anything that we could take out of today's discussion, it's this: don't be a Kodak. I'm actually thinking of creating T-shirts for my channel, and this would be a great one. Don't be a Kodak. I mean, let me know in the comments if you are interested in getting hold of a T-shirt like that, and perhaps it's something we will do. Don't let your talent sit in a drawer or on a shelf. Step into the light. I mean, excuse the pun, but step into the light and let's get you into photography where you really want to be. Ralph says he'll be staying in chat for a few minutes more, so he'll keep chat open after this discussion. We haven't received many more comments since, but I expect the comments will be coming in once we start talking about gear. If you have any questions that come in now, we can also deal with them in the YouTube recording. And remember, at the end of this entire seminar, all 5 recordings, I will have a free document for you, a full summary and a transcript of all 5 lessons. So you won't find it there yet because this is only the first one, but once I'm done with everything, it will be there. Next week, we're going to tackle the discussion around the elephant in the room, the smartphone versus the camera debate, and we are going to be going into the photographic gear. I'm Martin Osner, and I want to thank you for your time. From me, Ralph, and Sam, until next week, go well, be safe, and remain creative. Why? Because it's just good for you. It's the right thing to do. Cheers for now, everybody. See you next week.